Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Spellbinders has a new wintertime collaboration with House Mouse Design, and they sent them to me to create with and share with you. Today I'm using the Snuggle Up stamp set, and it has this adorable image of the mice snuggling up with a few different sentiments. There's the snuggle is real, sending hugs, and miss you. I absolutely love that these stamp sets include sentiments to go with them. I'm going to do some watercolor with them, and I'm using some distress white watercolor paper. I love the fact that it's nice and bright white, so when you use colors on them, it's not affected by an off-white background. You get nice, bright, true colors. I'm going to stamp and emboss my image. I'm going to stamp it with Versamark ink and emboss it with black embossing powder. You don't have to emboss to do watercolor. You could use a permanent ink like StazOn and then watercolor with that. I like the embossing because I like the ridges and I like the little glossy lines that it gives. If you wanted to do watercoloring without embossing, you could use a black StazOn pad. It's a nice permanent ink, but then when you're doing your watercolor, you need to make sure you let areas dry before you do watercoloring beside them. Otherwise, you're going to have your inks bleeding together. It tends not to happen as much when you do embossed images than just images with plain ink, because those ridges kind of hold those pieces separate. You do get a little bleeding if you happen to go outside of the lines or whatnot, but it in general is a little bit easier for watercolor. So for someone that might be new to watercolor, embossing might be a really good way to start and try it. I'm also going to use some masking magic sheets. I want to do something on the background here before I start to watercolor, and I want to make sure I don't get any of this on the mice. So by using the masking magic sheets, I'm going to be able to mask off those areas and not get the paste that I'm putting on the background onto the front of those mice. Now, you could also do this same thing with printer paper and removable adhesive. That would work just as well. I like the masking sheets because they already have the adhesive on them. It's kind of like a big Post-it note sheet. They're very easy to stamp on and very easy to cut out. And this particular shape is a really easy one to cut out. What I'm wanting to do here is put some snowflakes in the background, and I want them to have some texture to them. So I'm using the masking sheet so that I don't get any of these snowflakes from the stencil on the front of my image. I want them just behind. I want it to be more texture and to affect the sky, but I don't necessarily want it to affect the image. Because when I use this texture paste, it's going to create a resist. I don't necessarily want these white flake resists on the front of the image. If you want it there and you like the look of that, or that's the look you're going for, you absolutely can do it. I just wanted those snowflakes to be on the back side of it. Now, because my image is stamped and embossed, I've got those raised areas from the image. So the masking part doesn't necessarily stick super well to the image. It's enough for what I'm doing, but just keep in mind that because that image is raised, it does affect the stick of those masking sheets. I'm going to use a palette knife with some texture paste sparkle and just go over the background. Now, this particular stencil isn't wide enough to do the entire background, so I'm doing part of it, letting it dry completely, and I waited about a half an hour, and then I'm doing the other part of it. I'm keeping the masking sheets on for both of it. And as soon as I'm done, while I'm letting those things dry, I clean off my palette knife as well as my stencil. You don't want those things to dry on the stencil because it takes a lot more to get it off if you've let it dry. Much easier to quickly go and clean it off while it's still wet on the stencil. Then it takes very little elbow grease. It usually comes right off. And really, you don't even need soap. Just a little bit of warm water is enough. I'm going to use some magical or Lindy's magical powders for the leaves. I've got this autumn leaf set here, which is perfect for these little leaves here. I love these powders because you don't need very much. You can watercolor with them or you can create other techniques with them. I have used them in the past with some different projects. So if you look on my channel, you'll be able to see other projects that I've used them with. I love the fact that there are so many different ways to use them and they have a bit of shimmer to them. So once this is completely dry, you'll be able to see that these leaves have a slight shimmer to them. It just gives them a little bit of different texture when you're watercoloring. And I always love adding things that have a little bit of texture to them. To me, it makes an image look a little bit more interesting, which is also why I wanted to do those snowflakes on the background. Again, gives it a little bit of texture, makes it look a bit more interesting. So I've got some green, orange, red, and a little bit of brown of these Lindy's Magicals, and I'm blending them together so I've got some autumn leaves that have a little bit of variation to them. Now, the shimmer to this is fairly subtle. It's not really in your face. It's not a lot of shine. It's not a lot of glitter. I like the difference in texture. If that's not your cup of tea, you could just use regular watercolors to color this and still blend them together and it would look beautiful as well. I'm going to be using distressed refills for the rest of the watercolor. I'm going to use refills for the sky and the stump, and then I'm going to use some oxide refills for the little mice. I have a water brush here that has water right in the handle. It makes it really easy for watercoloring. I've got a little piece of paper towel on the side that I just keep cleaning my brush off to change between colors. I also like the fact that I don't have an open jar of water to be cleaning a brush here. I tend to be quite a klutz, so if I had an open jar of water, there's a very good chance I would knock it over. By having a brush like this, I don't have to worry about that. And there you got a bit of a sneak peek of the shine that you get with these Lindy's Magicals. And I love the fact that you can use them to create backgrounds. They create some beautiful things, but you can also use them for watercoloring. I love any tool that has multiple ways of using it. And speaking of multiple ways of using it, that's also what distress reinkers are for. These are for re-inking your ink pads, but because they're a beautiful dye-based ink, they work great for watercoloring. You can use a really concentrated form of that color, or you can add more water and get more blended out lighter version of that color. It has so much versatility and it's one of my favorite ways for watercoloring. They're so easy to use. I have these little palettes that I have already done and I have them ready to go. I put a little label at the bottom right of each color with the color name, and then I use the color to watercolor over top of it so I could see exactly what color tone that was. These you do need to lay horizontal to store. You don't want to tip them up vertically because those colors never dry on that plastic. So they would run out and contaminate each other if you did that. I have a tiny little shelf that I have them sitting in, so they're always ready to go. I can easily take my re-inker dropper bottle and add a little bit more, and I'll had to do that in the middle of this sky. But it's a nice way to give a second use to those re-inkers. And it's one of my favorite ways of watercoloring because they're ready to go and I have a lot of colors to choose from, as well as the fact that I have the pads to go with them. So if I need to do some ink blending, I can coordinate those colors exactly. And I will do a little bit of ink blending once my watercolor image is done with the same colors that I used for watercoloring. So I used some speckled egg on the sky and I'm using walnut stain on the little stump here. And you can see with the sky, and you'll see as I'm working on the stump, how you can get so much color variation from one color. That sky is just one color and this stump is only one color of brown. So you can get a lot of color variation just with very few colors really. I always start where I want the color to be darkest and then I blend it out, and then I will go back in with that concentrated color and I will tap my brush in the wet areas, to make more dark areas, concentrated color. And I'm doing that on the stump here, right below the mice where there would be some shadow. I'm making sure that I have some really good concentration of color. On the side of the stump, I'm doing it dark around the edges and then having a little bit lighter in the front where there would be more light hitting it. Now for the sky, I did all the way around the mice, starting there with the dark and then blended it out, and then went from the paper edges, starting dark there and then blending it out. I wanted color variation. I didn't want a flat color for the sky. Now I will say, because we have those texture paste snowflakes in there, it's just a gloss texture paste that has a little bit of glitter in it, but because of that texture, it's a little bit harder to blend out when you have that texture paste on there. Not that it's impossible, it just interferes with the brush a little bit. I use this detailer brush on it. You could use a broad brush like the Ranger or the Tim Holtz broad water brush, and you would get a little bit more water in your brush bristles, making it a little bit easier. I only wanted to use one brush, and like I said, it's not impossible. It just makes it a little bit more challenging. But when these pieces are still wet, it's very easy to go in and add a little bit of color and just tap it on, and it starts to blend with the rest of the color that's already there. So it's a really easy way to add a little bit more darkness if you want it. Now I'm going to let that completely dry, and then I'm going to start working on the mice. Now I chose to do Hickory Smoke for the mice, which is a nice gray color, and then I'm doing Tattered Rose for the nose, ears, tail, and feet. I wanted these mice to be gray. I typically do them in a brown color, but because that stump is brown and because those leaves are brown, I kind of thought if I did them brown, it would be a little bit too much brown. So by doing them gray, it just adds a little bit different color. I'm doing the oxide because it is a dye and pigment blend. It has a little bit more of a chalky finish. And again, it's going to give a different finish or a different texture to the front of my card. Whereas the dye is just a translucent color and you don't get that chalky finish to it. So just basically another way of getting a little bit more texture to the front of my card. Because it has that pigment to it, it's going to have that texture or that chalkiness, but that embossing is still resisting that ink. So I don't have to worry about that pigment covering up my lines here. It doesn't cover it up at all. It just repels it basically. I keep working and making sure to blend it. You'll see every once in a while I get a little bit too much ink. So what I do is I clean off my brush. I take that brush to pick up a little bit more of the ink just to lighten it a little bit, and then I wipe it off on the paper towel. It's very easy to watercolor with these, and that's one of the reasons why I love them. They're a little bit forgiving, so if you get a little bit too much color, it's very easy to take some off. Most of the times with things, I often will say less is more, and you can't take it away. In this case, you can. Once it's dry, it's a little bit harder, but while it's still wet, it's really easy to just grab your brush, make sure it's clean, and take a little bit of that excess off. Or to lighten the color by adding a little bit of water. And it's very easy, again, like I said before, to darken it by taking a little bit more of that color and tapping it into the wet areas. If you have a little bit of color bleeding, you can also take that brush and pick that up and remove it as well. Now I keep a palette with the distress reinkers for watercoloring with. I don't keep any for the oxides for watercoloring with. And the reason is because the oxide is a dye and pigment blend, it tends to separate. So I keep those in the bottle. It's very easy to shake the bottle to mix those two together. But you could even see on my palette or on my work surface how quickly the colors started separating, that dye and the pigment started to separate. So I don't want to have to keep mixing them together on an ink palette. So I just do those when I want to watercolor with them. I just pull them out, mix them up, put a drop or two on the surface that I'm working on, and then watercolor from there. I tend not to do a lot of watercoloring with the oxides, mainly for that reason, as well as the fact that I love the translucency you get from the regular distress inks. But I do like using them periodically just for a little bit of extra color difference, a little bit of extra texture difference. So I'm using that same speckled egg pad as well as the walnut stain pad just to do a little bit of ink blending around my image after I've trimmed it down. I want to make sure, I like having the shading around the edges just to give a little bit of a frame to that image. I'm taking a scrap piece of white cardstock and I'm going to take one of the sentiments and stamp and emboss it with that same Versamark ink, the same black embossing powder that we used for the image, and I'm using the same embossing tool. This time I remember to use my embossing powder tool just to remove any excess oils or anything from the background of the cardstock. It just gives you a clear image. It's one of those steps that for some reason I forget it nearly every single time. I mean to get into a better habit of doing it. I always forget. I'm taking my tiny trimmer and trimming that sentiment right down. If you have a die that it fits, it would be perfect to use a die to die cut it as well. But I do like this tiny trimmer for just die cutting a sentiment really nice and close. Taking that image and gluing it to my card base. I'm using some Barely Art glue. I love how quickly this starts to hold. I always love using liquid glues, especially because it goes a long way. You don't need to use a whole lot and it starts to hold quite quickly. I'm using some foam tape to go on the back of my sentiment just to give it a little bit of a pop from the base of that card. You could glue it down flat as well if you wanted, but I wanted to give it just a little pop up from there. I'm trying to make sure to have it centered in that bottom there. You could also stamp and emboss that sentiment in the inside of the card. I always like to do it on the front if possible. I absolutely love this adorable image and the texture that you get from the texture paste as well as the Lindy's Magicals. Now for that mask that was created for this image, these can be used several times. So I put it right in that same packaging with that stamp set because if I ever use it again, it would be with that stamp set. And that packaging has plastic on it, so it's really easy to store in there. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fantastic day.